Good afternoon and welcome to the Alden Room. We are very pleased to have Dr. Matthew Hendley present the 6th Alden Scholar Series lecture titled Kinder and Gentler Imperialists, British Women in Organized Patriotic Movements in World War I. This is based on his monograph, Organized Patriotism and the Crucible of War, Popular Imperialism in Britain, 1914 to 1932. We're very pleased to have Dan Birnbaum here, and he is from, I'm going to say this incorrectly, Damascene Bookseller. He will be selling copies of this book, which Dr. Hendley is very happy to sign after the lecture today. The Alden Scholar Series is a joint collaboration between the library and members of the Department of History, with the sole purpose of celebrating faculty scholarship. We are now accepting proposals for our Spring 2015 series, and the deadline for submission is February 20th, 2015. More information is available in the flyers on the brown table right before you exit the room, or you can contact Heather Beach as well. The Alden Scholar Series lectures are held in the Alden Room, which was named for Jessica Alden, a 1906 graduate of the Oneonta Normal School. Ms. Alden returned to the Normal School as our first librarian, a position she held from 1913 to 1944. Within this room are various special collections, including the Lantern Slide Collection, New York State historical books, early textbooks, and the college's archives. To hold this lecture amongst these books and other treasures of this room is quite fitting. We would like to thank everyone who helped make everything come together for this event. Special thanks go to Dr. Matthew Hendley, the members of the committee, Andrew Solar, our Alden Room intern, for arranging the eye-catching display outside the room, Diana Mosman from TLTC, Dennis Gregory, head custodian of Milne Library, for getting the room in such beautiful shape and providing extra seating, Dave Giese and the Milne Library for providing refreshments. I do have a few announcements and reminders before we begin. For any student wishing to receive leave credit, please see Lois Baldwin at the back of the room. She can sign you in after the lecture. Because of the fragile nature of the collections in this room, it is important not to leave any crumbs or any other things that would attract pesky visitors that could possibly damage the materials. So we ask that there be no food or drink in the room, except for our speaker who has water. You'll have noticed comment cards on your chairs, and writing instruments, if you don't have them, are available on the round table. If you could please take a minute to fill these cards out before you go. The feedback we receive from them is very, very helpful. You can leave the completed forms on your chairs, or you can drop them in the box that is available on the round table. And finally, we'd just like to alert you to the 2 emergency exits, and also ask that you turn cell phones off at this time. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Matthew Hendley, Professor of History. Dr. Hendley received his Master's in History from McGill University in 1991 and his PhD in History from the University of Toronto in 1998. He is a specialist in modern British history and the history of the British Empire. We have been fortunate to have Dr. Hendley on faculty in the Department of History at SUNY Oneonta since 2001. During his time with the college, he has taught numerous courses for the History Department, including senior seminars and faculty-led overseas courses in Shanghai, China, and Hong Kong. He has won numerous academic honors and awards, including the Research and Scholarship Award Research Foundation of the State University of New York, where he was one of 3 professors honored at SUNY College at Oneonta, and one of 29 professors throughout the entire SUNY system to be recognized for research excellence in 2007. He also received the Richard Siegfried Prize for Academic Excellence, which is awarded for academic achievement to junior non-tenured faculty, State University of New York College at Oneonta in the fall of 2003. Dr. Hendley has enjoyed a prolific publishing career. His publications include a self-authored monograph, a co-edited book, Imagining Globalization, Language, Identities, and Boundaries, as well as 3 chapters in books and 5 peer-reviewed scholarly articles and numerous conference papers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hendley as he speaks to us on this very special Veterans Day about kinder and gentler imperialists, British women, and organized patriotic movements in World War I, based on his first monograph, Organized Patriotism in the Crucible of War, Popular Imperialism in Britain, 1914 to 1932.
I better get my water, the exception to the rule. Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming out today. And today is a special day as far as the First World War goes. This is the 100th anniversary of the beginning of World War I in this year. And the First World War in American history is sort of a footnote. I mean, certainly the United States was involved and played an important role, but it didn't mark the history of this country nearly the way that it marked the histories of countries like Great Britain. In many ways, Great Britain has never fully recovered from the First World War. They lost over 750,000 killed. They had several million people wounded. And Britain really never recovered its great power status after victory in World War I. But my talk today is not going to be about the war in general. It's going to be about a specific aspect of the impact of the war, and that is how it affected popular imperialist movements. And I thought it was an appropriate choice because today is November 11th. In Great Britain and Canada, this is called Remembrance Day, and everybody wears a poppy, just as I'm wearing here, to remember the sacrifices of soldiers, particularly on the Western Front. And the poppy is, of course, a symbol that came into prominence based on a poem by a Canadian poet, John McCrae, who wrote the poem In Flanders Fields. Let's see what we're going to talk about today. My talk is entitled Kinder and Gentler Imperialists, and I'm interested specifically about the role of British women in patriotic organizations. This talk is based on my book here, which is called Organized Patriotism in the Crucible of War. I like to tell people it's the perfect gift for all occasions. So Thanksgiving's coming, Christmas is coming, there's multiple copies there for sale. And what you see in the cover here is, this is designed by the publisher. This is the symbol of one of the groups I'm going to talk about, Victoria Lee. The visual artist who created it, I think, was trying to show some sort of phoenix-like rebirth, I guess. What I'm talking about, especially in this book, just to sum it down quickly, is I've sort of tried to re-examine how the First World War affected the phenomenon of popular imperialism in Britain. And I was particularly interested in using gender history as a conceptual lens and understanding how images of masculinity and femininity affect political culture and symbolism. And I was also interested in this idea of associational culture, and this is something scholars in British history are becoming more interested in. After World War I, there was an urge for a sort of nonpartisan space where men and women could cooperate in civic organizations. And using these two concepts, I decided to examine 3 patriotic and imperialist organizations that were founded before 1914. In my book, I argued that the National Service League, which was a strongly masculinist organization dominated by men and supporting compulsory military service, this group floundered in wartime, whereas groups with strong female memberships, with goals related to things like education and philanthropy and hospitality, and using language which spoke of family, home, and kinship, these groups prospered after 1918 and created what I like to call domesticated imperialism. So this presentation in particular is going to focus on contrasting 2 of these groups. One of them, the National Service League, which I argued was a very militaristic, masculinist organization, and the other group, the logo on the book cover, the Victoria League. And I'm the first scholar ever to look at all of these groups of my study from the pre-war period into the war and beyond. So, let's get a little bit of orientation here. We are in the United States after all. So here's the British Empire in 1914. And of course, the United States is absent. We had a revolution. We left the club. But there's still a lot of territory on the map. And as you can see, schoolmasters used to tell their children the sun never sets on the British Empire. The empire spanned from North America right into South America, Africa, Asia, Australia, all the continents on the earth. Now we should remember there's a lot of variation of the type of territories within the empire. There are some areas which are dependent, in which the people have basically minimal political freedoms, and the British rule from the top down. But there's also self-governing parts of the empire, which include Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and if you consider the white minority to be self-governing, South Africa. And the organizations that I'm interested in, Victoria League, was particularly focused on these self-governing parts. So when they speak of imperialism, it's a sort of perhaps slightly different vision of imperialism than some stereotypes of an empire would have us believe. Now let us begin talking about the National Service League. The National Service League was founded after the South African War of 1899 to 1902, in which Britain experienced tremendous trouble trying to subjugate the Boer Dutch-speaking population of that area. And there was a man called George Shee who wrote a book called The Britain's First Duty. And he argued, in fact, what Britain needed was some form of compulsory military training. Britain has always relied on a volunteer army. They had great pride on this. But George Shee argued that they should embrace compulsory military training. Now this idea was not popular, and in fact it would fail before the war. No one would sign on. But they did get a fair number of followers. By 1914, there was over 100,000 members of the National Service League, and they had attracted quite a few prominent conservatives to support their efforts. I've argued in some articles that the League tried to expand its vision to claim not only would conscription give Britain stronger home defense, but it would also improve the health and prosperity of the nation, supposedly, if everyone went through a bout of military training. For the most part, though, this was not a popular stance. People thought it was too partisan an idea. People disliked the aristocratic leadership of the organization. Trade unionists hated it. But the one leader that sort of made it at least worth discussing was Lord Roberts. Lord Roberts was a successful military man, and he took over the National Service League in December 1905 and led it to tremendous growth into World War I. He was born in India. He is of Anglo-Irish Protestant ancestry, and he was an imperial hero, leading British troops to victory in India, Afghanistan, and the South African War. He was a dynamic figure. He was fairly controversial. He basically told people before 1914 a war was on the horizon, and Germany was going to be the likely opponent. And as a result, people got talking about the National Service League. It entered into the public debate, but it never, succeeded enough to implement its goals. Now, once the First World War began, Lord Roberts and the National Service League had the best and the worst of both worlds. On the one hand, everything they had predicted had come true. Germany had indeed embroiled Europe in the war. The British Army was too small, so in many ways you would think this was their moment. But, in fact, the National Service League struggled because voluntary enlistment was still strong, people still distrusted its leadership, so it sort of marked time in the opening months of the war. Early in the war, the League suspended its propaganda. They tried to get involved in voluntary efforts. There's an appeal they made to collect field glasses from people, I guess, who hunt deer and stuff, and they're going to give them to the army. But it really doesn't have a proper place for itself. It certainly wasn't helped by the fact that Lord Roberts, who was 80 by this time, had pretty antiquated views. In one speech I read of his from August 10th, 1914, a week after the war begun, Lord Roberts says, "There must be no hanging back in this country. Men must work, women must weep." Now, that's not perhaps the broadest view of gender relations. Women cry and men do all the work. And this would really be a sort of a sign that the League was going to have a lot of trouble adjusting to changed circumstances. Roberts also had relatively backwards views of the empire. Even though he had led Indian troops in battle, he firmly believed that the Indian soldiers, like the Sikhs and Gurkhas, always had to be led by British officers. So in many ways, he was very much in his Victorian mindset. And to him, British imperialism was an unbridled good, a force to transfer civilization, a force that would bring Christian civilization to the world. And he didn't really think too deeply about whether it should be more appealing or not. Now, Lord Roberts would die early in the war, in November 1914. He was frustrated at being unable to do much in the war effort. He decided to visit Indian troops, which had been sent to the Western Front and were pretty uncomfortable in the trenches and the mud and the cold of France. And Lord Roberts, while visiting the Indian contingent, caught cold and died. And in my book, I note that his death brought forth a sort of amazing coda to traditional popular imperialism. He was suddenly celebrated by people who had often criticized his political agenda. He was described as the perfect Christian soldier. He had been active in temperance work, trying to encourage British soldiers not to drink, which is a pretty thankless task, as well as trying to Christianize the army. He was big on extra church services for his men. In many ways, he was the perfect sort of Christian family man, a domesticated hero. And he was put in the pantheon of imperial heroes. There was a bust of Lord Roberts placed in St. Paul's Cathedral, and I found an interesting photograph of a Canadian graduate student visiting that 20 years ago. It looks somewhat familiar. But he still lies there, Lord Roberts, beneath that bust. And if you go in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral, right near Admiral Nelson, the hero of Trafalgar, there's a simple cross and a grave site that says merely Roberts. Lord Roberts would have an enormous funeral, the biggest funeral in London since Lord Wellington, the victor at the Battle of Waterloo, with thousands of people lining the streets. Many people thought perhaps they could use this blast of publicity for Lord Roberts to perhaps reinvigorate the National Service League. But this was not to be. Early in 1914, the British launched a massive voluntary enlistment campaign. This man, Lord Kitchener, who had been the protege of Lord Roberts in South Africa, was appointed as the Secretary of State for War. And this famous poster was one of many which encouraged millions of British men to enlist. And Britain was unique. Of all the powers in World War I, Britain was the only power to enter the war and maintain an all-volunteer army for at least 2 years. Britain and the British Empire. And in fact, in the first 2 years of the war, over 2 million men enlisted in the British Army. And there were calls for enlistment throughout the empire. Here's a evocative poster. We have the old lion calling on the young lions. And here they are, Australia, Canada, India, New Zealand, all are being called on to enlist to fight for the empire. And the numbers were impressive. India raised by voluntary recruitment over 1.5 million men to fight for the British Empire. Canada enlisted over 450,000 Canadians out of a population of 7 million to fight overseas. Australia, 300,000, and the list goes on. But even these numbers couldn't deal with the carnage on the Western Front. As I'm sure you're aware, World War I was a war of attrition. People were in the trenches. Most battles were bloody fiascos. And eventually they had to impose conscription. In May of 1916, the British government finally agreed to make compulsory service mandatory. And this was the beginning of the end of the National Service League. With Lord Roberts dead and conscription on the books, the National Service League had to figure out what its role was in Britain, in war, and later. And in my book, I chronicled some sort of forgotten episodes in which the National Service League tried to reach out, tried to reformulate its vision of popular imperialism, and failed. At one point, they approached a group called the Royal Colonial Institute, which was an imperial organization devoted to spreading academic information about the empire, and they had a beautiful library in London. In another episode, the National Service League reached out to patriotic working class organizations. None of these things worked. And they perhaps were not helped that some of the leadership that took over after Lord Roberts certainly lacked the common touch. This man symbolizes this sort of pompous leadership that the League had. This figure here is Lord Curzon. He was the viceroy to India. He was a notably arrogant man. When he was a student at Oxford University, his fellow students came up with a little verse to make fun of him that goes like this. "My name is George Nathaniel Curzon. I am a most superior person." And you can sort of get a glimpse of him. He certainly was not somebody who's going to lead the National Service League to new heights of popularity. Lord Curzon, though, did propose a few ideas. He said the National Service League perhaps could stick around and could promote patriotic unity, could promote physical training in schools, and would have a role once the war was over. And when that didn't go on very well, he suggested the National Service League could create an Imperial Veterans Organization. So he's envisioning once the war is over, he thought that you could raise the level of imperial and national consciousness of soldiers if you had a group that could coordinate veterans' activities, it could keep up morale, it could find charity for soldiers who'd fallen on hard times. None of these ideas succeeded. And one of the major reasons they failed is that people just didn't trust someone like Lord Curzon. He was too partisan, he was too haughty, he was too distant. He certainly didn't fit the growing idea of associational culture, which would be a safe space for sort of people of different social classes to get together. And Lord Curzon certainly was not open towards female participation in any way as well. Eventually, another prominent figure, Lord Milner, decided to shut down the National Service League. Milner was also an ardent imperialist. He had been the British High Commissioner in South Africa before the South African War of 1899. And in 1917, it was decided to suspend the National Service League and to shut it down for the war. And the League had quite a bit of money. At this time, it had about £11,000 in the bank. You can multiply it by about 50 to 60 to translate that to equivalent funds in 2012 currency. But the League never resumed activities, and eventually, in 1921, they gave all their money to the Boy Scouts Association. So, having looked at this failed episode, why don't we compare it with a more successful group, and that is the Victoria League. The Victoria League is named after this rather formidable-looking lady, and that is Queen Victoria, who was Queen of Britain from 1837 to 1901. When she died, a group was founded, the Victoria League, and its whole raison d'etre was to, quote, establish a society for knitting more closely together British subjects dwelling in different parts of the empire. This group was consciously to be a non-party organization, open to anybody from any political party, and it really decided to try to make popular imperialism part of the daily life of ordinary people. The Royal Colonial Institute, which we mentioned, had failed to merge with the National Service League. They had been big on theory and research and academic papers. The Victoria League instead wanted to concentrate on things like imperial hospitality for visitors to Britain, on education, on issues such as this. And the group was also, there's the pin of Victoria, it was female-centered. The Victoria League's leadership initially was completely female, and its main fields of activity, imperial education and hospitality, were consciously designed with women in mind, because a typical woman in 1914, if she was a middle class or upper class woman, these are the sort of things she would be active in. The Victoria League spoke of practical imperialism, or sometimes sane imperialism. And in the war, they would have a number of major outreaches, which I will discuss. All told, you could say that this formed what I've classified as a kinder and gentler form of imperialism. Now let's talk a little bit about the organization and personnel of the Victoria League. Perhaps one of the most prominent figures is this lady, Lady Jersey, the Countess of Jersey. The Victoria League, as I said, was open to people of all political parties. Lady Jersey, as I'll tell you, was conservative. Other leading figures were members of the Liberal Party. And the conservatives and the liberals really hated each other before World War I. So this is quite a feat to get them to sit together. Some members of this group, the women in the organization, were what are called liberal unionists. That's a sort of halfway between a conservative and liberal. And after 1918, they even brought prominent women in from the Labour Party, from the left. So it was open to all politically. Now, Lady Jersey was perhaps the perfect choice to be the initial president of this league. She had traveled all over the empire, to India, to Egypt, to Australia, to New Zealand, and the Pacific. Her husband was a godson of Queen Victoria, and he was a rather minor member of the government in the House of Lords. The highlight of her husband's career was to be the governor of New South Wales in Australia. So basically, she was able to sort of see the empire at its zenith, at its highest point. And one biographer of her said she easily absorbed the imperial idea. The title of her autobiography perhaps shows her worldview. She died in 1927, but when she published this book in 1922, she entitled it 51 Years in Victorian Life. And of course, the Victorian age has been over for 21 years, but she's still using that as the title. As a well-placed conservative woman, she had a lot of wealth, and in fact, this is her house. And I always like to tell people, if you live in a house like that, you better be a conservative, because otherwise. But this house, which is the family seat of the Earl of Jersey and her husband's family, this is about 9 miles west of London, and she would host big gatherings of like-minded imperialists to discuss the issues of the day. Politically, she was conservative. We should also note, even though she was a woman, she opposed women's suffrage, that is, the right for women to vote. She believed that any woman who could influence political events, who deserved to do so, was able to do so without a vote. And that's easy to say when you live in a house like this, perhaps less so for your average woman. Her aristocratic background, her political contacts helped her recruit widely, and she would remain as president of the Victoria League till 1927. But she's not the only prominent woman involved in this group. Another woman here, Violet Markham, is a good counter to Lady Jersey. Violet Markham was a liberal. She was not a member of the aristocracy. She was from a wealthy background. Her father had owned coal mines in England, and she inherited that wealth. But she was a liberal. She served as mayor of Chesterfield in England for a year, and was very active in charitable work, helping women's employment, helping the unemployed. And she even ran unsuccessfully for Parliament in 1918. We should note that her views were social imperialist. She was notably not too kind to groups she felt got in Britain's way. She wrote a pretty inflammatory book about the South African War, in which she said that Britain needed to go to war with the Dutch-speaking Boers to, quote, put the Dutch in their place. I think President Orlando would enjoy that quote. So she really felt that Britain was the prominent power, and they shouldn't let people interfere with that fact. But nevertheless, she did believe strongly in helping the poor. She believed in voluntary action. And she also, despite her liberal background, initially also opposed women's suffrage. She believed that men, because of their greater physical strength, were, quote, imperial protectors. Women, she felt, were civilizers. So women should improve sort of local society, people's daily lives. It was up to men to guard the empire and vote. During the war, though, she would change her mind. She would embrace women's suffrage, but she was a little pessimistic that it would make much difference. Now, all told, the Victoria League was a smaller organization than the National Service League, but they did quite a few activities. In the last year of the war, the Victoria League had about 3,000 members, compared to the 100,000 of the National Service League before 1914. But they were active in a whole range of activities that I'd like to outline. And what I'd particularly like to focus in this presentation is their activities in the field of hospitality and philanthropy, which they believe presented what they call a sane or practical imperialism. Now, several of these activities got going before the war even started. One of these activities was called the Settlers' Welcome Program. Before 1914, there were hundreds of thousands of people emigrating from Britain, particularly to places like Canada, Australia, and even the United States. Beginning in 1908, the Victoria League started this program called Settlers' Welcome. And the idea was to give advice, to give guidance, to give a sense of comfort to British people leaving familiar shores to start a new life somewhere in the British Empire. As they said, we aim to give newcomers a friendly welcome from someone on the spot, ready to give advice and information. Now, many people were leaving Britain, somewhat lured by rather misleading propaganda. The Canadian government was telling people, come to Canada, leave the slums of London, what are you going to find? They called the Canadian prairies the last best West. They claimed homes for millions. You could make a living ranching, dairying, grain raising, fruit raising, mixed farming. What they didn't tell you is in the summer in Saskatchewan, it can get up to 110 Fahrenheit, and in the winter, it can probably get down to at least negative 40. So this is perhaps a little misleading, but as you can see, the vistas look promising. And the Victoria League Settlers Welcome Program was fairly effective. It would meet all ships coming from Britain. It would arrange board and lodging for people who arrived with no one to greet them. It gave settlers with a letter of introduction that they could show to make their initial contacts. It couldn't reach everybody because you had to, get sort of registered with the Victoria League before you left. But it helped almost 2,000 migrants before 1914. And in this way, it represented a way of bringing the empire into people's daily lives. Another thing the Victoria League did was to embrace what historians refer to as social imperialism. And in that light, they actually sponsored a major conference in London in May 1914 called the Imperial Health Conference. Violet Markham, our friend from earlier, the liberal lady, she was very involved in doing this, and this exhibition pointed to important, pertinent topics that were affecting Britain before the war, like housing, child labor, child care. They had an exhibit which was seen by over 3,000 people. Delegates from all over the United Kingdom attended, and most people noted that this was a major success. We should note, though, that they didn't really give too many decisive solutions to any of these problems. They admitted the problems existed, but they did not propose, massive welfare state type creations. In some ways, they were actually perhaps a bit condescending. Some of their advice for working class mothers were basically faulting their child raising skills rather than the environments they were living in. But they did call for some progressive things, including better pay for midwives, pasteurized milk for children, greater sex education to limit unwanted births. So in their way, they were moving forward. This conference got quite a lot of publicity in the British press. What I found fascinating was that they actually ended the conference by quoting the famous poem by William Blake called Jerusalem. And in this poem, there's the famous quote, sorry if I can find it. I think it goes, here we go. I will not cease from mental flight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem and England's green and pleasant land. And that's a poem the Labour Party actually used. And when the Labour Party was elected in 1945, many years after these events, people talked about creating a new Jerusalem. So here you have an imperialist organization 40 years before, using the exact same words that the left would later use. Now, within World War I, some of their more interesting activities to bring the empire into daily life involved hospitality, particularly towards imperial soldiers and imperial nurses. And some of these were notably successful. In London and in England in general during the war, you had thousands and thousands of people from British imperial armies in London waiting to be shipped out, on leave, getting ready to go home, and many of them had no place to stay. So the Victoria League stepped into the gap to create a series of clubs for these soldiers. And if you look closely in this picture, you can barely see it, it says Victoria League Club. And here we have Australian soldiers getting off the omnibus, ready to go to one. By the end of 1918, over 1 million meals had been served to soldiers at Victoria League clubs, and over 250,000 beds had been slept in, 250,000 nights of occupancy of a bed in a Victoria League club. There were many reasons the Victoria League did this. They wanted to recognize the wartime sacrifices by imperial forces. They wanted to create bonds of empire that would last beyond the war. And they kept expanding their locations. Eventually, they had multiple locations in London. One of them I've been able to trace is at a place called Hatton Garden, which is here near Farringdon, Barbican area of central London. Eventually, they were costing the Victoria League over £1,000 a year to run this particular location, and they would expand into Edinburgh, Glasgow, Liverpool, Dundee. After April 1917, Americans were also welcome to stay at Victoria League clubs once the United States had joined the war. Now, in my research, I'm interested in showing how going to these clubs really helped foster a sense of imperial unity. And certainly the conditions inside the clubs were pretty different than the conditions you would have later on. I should mention as well, the clubs were recognized by visits from the King, King George V, as well as Queen Mary. Conditions, though, on the front were nothing like conditions in the club. I mean, this is a typical meal you might have in a trench, and they're lucky they're not being shelled, of course, but there's a coal-fired cooking furnace there, and somebody sitting on a box chowing down. Generally, in the trenches, life was not very pleasant. One South African wrote back to the Victoria League saying that when he was in the club, he said, "It thrilled one to feel we'd been drawn to the old country by the same feeling. We knew nothing about it, but everyone realized what it meant." And in this way, England sort of had a sense of home for many soldiers who would write with very positive replies back once they were at the front. One soldier even said it hurt to compare, he said, the excellent meals and cooking we received at the club with the present food he was eating in the trenches. It just broke his heart to think about that. And there was praise particularly for the women of the Victoria League, who maintained a homey atmosphere. Often families back home were similarly grateful for the Victoria League clubs. Anxious mothers, wives, sisters, sweethearts often wrote the Victoria League saying that they were comforted to know how well our boys and men were looked after. We should note perhaps that this was a particular concern. In Canada, there was a bit of a panic, a moral panic later in the war. It would seem for various reasons, quite a few lonely and naive troops, particularly from Canada, were finding their way into the beds of London prostitutes. So letters would appear from the Canadian Red Cross saying, "Why don't we have a safe place for our boys to sleep? They won't be lured by these English sirens of the night." And the Victoria League, for their bit, were able to help with that. But what's even more interesting, I think, is their hospitality efforts towards women, which is a very understudied part of the First World War. Here we have an Australian nurse in England, and this is a kangaroo she's brought just for memories of home. Women, of course, also played a large role in the war, and the Victoria League quickly got in touch with leading matrons of the nursing services of all the self-governing dominions and got lists of all the women who were in England during the war. And they then made full use of their organization to help. They hosted tea parties, they organized excursions, and perhaps even more intriguing, they arranged rest periods for nurses who were just completely burned out. One Australian nurse wrote in a letter I found, she said, "This arranged rest period put years on my life. The angels must have put the idea of the Victoria League into your minds. You cannot imagine what a blessing it is for poor, tired Australians." And the matron of the Canadian hospital unit also noted the Victoria League provided a hearty welcome for nurses, giving them rest and a chance to decompress. And here we have another rather posed photograph. This is the sort of thing the Victoria League would have done, allowing nurses to have a break, showing some sensitivity towards them. The last initiative we should mention of the Victoria League, which was also a traditional female activity, was tending war graves. There had been many men killed in war, and this had created thousands of mourning women and families. Early in the war, the Victoria League offered to help the British government help care for graves of any imperial soldier who died in Britain during the war. And this was seen as a particular sort of feminine duty, building on the existing gender ideas at the time, to care for the dead, to give them a final resting place. And it was in many ways an appropriate way for women to express their sense of imperialism. This graves work included corresponding with the families of those killed, sending pictures of the very well-tended graves back to the families, basically treating this as a human moment. And there's a lot of very poignant correspondence I read, which sort of ties into our whole idea of remembering and sacrifice for Remembrance Day. And that is that they, recognize the sense of loss. Because when you lost a soldier, the military sends you a form, and it just says, killed in action, and then they shut the door and they leave. And this does very little to help people's sense of loss. So the Victoria League provided the sort of human element in which their experience with hospitality, with sentiment, really was most appropriate. And the British, after the war was over, would develop a whole network of cemeteries for British Commonwealth and British soldiers. This is the famous monument at Vimy Ridge, which my wife and I visited in France. And these are sites of pilgrimage for people from all over Britain and Australia and Canada, New Zealand, even to this day. And they're all designed as beautiful gardens. They're very stark reminders of the sacrifice of war. We should note that in all of this, the Victoria League was particularly helpful at making emotional and mental space for women. They were fully aware that although women were not frontline combatants, women could be subject to overwork, to loneliness, to uncertainty, and by making space for them, showing sensitivity, recognizing the emotional struggles of female survivors, I think they played a key role in helping establish their organization to last into the post-war period in a much more creative and expanded manner than the National Service League ever could. And then the Victoria League also, we should know, was able to redefine what it meant to be British, what it meant to have an empire in a domesticated and feminized manner. To the Victoria League, England was not merely the possession of warriors sitting around a fire or making male banter over billiards. England could be an England of country rests and gardens and walks in the fresh air. In many ways, therefore, Englishness and imperialism was redefined in a way that was more domesticated, more private, and if we look at sense of gender ideas before 1914, more feminine. And I'm not saying the Victoria League alone, completely redefined this, but certainly they contributed towards this trend. And I argue it's unsurprising that groups like the National Service League, with their distant aristocratic leaders and their fairly uncreative ideas, went by the wayside. The Victoria League was able to continue. And in fact, the Victoria League still exists. Here's a picture I just found recently of a student at their headquarters in London. Today it's called the Victoria League for Commonwealth Friendship. In the 1990s, when I did the research this book was based on, they have and still have a student house in which they welcomed people from all over the British Commonwealth who are studying in London to stay there. If you ever are in London, here's where it is. It's in West London, at a place called Leinster Square, right near the Bayswater tube stop. And it's in an old building, perhaps not as well maintained as it could be, but certainly offering pretty cheap lodging for visiting people from India and Pakistan and Malaysia and Canada and Australia. When I was there, though, Americans at the time were not first on the invite list, and we have our revolution to blame for that. So therefore, the Victoria League, we should note, created a vision of empire that was not tied to any specific structure, was not tied to any specific political party, which showed flexibility, which offered a place for women, which used non-controversial activities like hospitality, tending graves, and the like, to articulate a vision of domesticated imperialism. And this vision was sufficient for the League to survive all the manifold changes from World War I. After World War I, women gained the vote. The Labour Party would form a government. The empire would start to break up, of course. But the Victoria League would ride through these changes and continue to exist to the present day. Before the First World War, the Victoria League defined itself as an organization devoted to practical imperialism, to sane patriotism. It saw itself as organizing sympathy throughout the empire, and it did relatively innocuous tasks. But I've argued in my book that that doesn't mean that it should be forgotten, because unlike the more, perhaps, prominent organizations which have gotten much attention from historians, those were short-lived creations, whereas the Victorian League found a winning formula and was able to create a kinder and more gentler form of imperialism. So in many ways, it's the polar opposite of the National Service League, which was too partisan, hard-edged, unwilling to change. And as I've said, the Victoria League has continued. Here's some of the staff of the Victoria League in London that helped me. When I did my research, I stayed there, I went into their attic, and they had all these dust-covered volumes that no one had looked at before, and I was able to blow the dust off and read them. They were a sort of happy crew there. If you ever study in Britain, I hope you're not afraid of beer, because certainly there's quite a bit of that. These are some happy students there. And I was even looking through my old pictures, and I found this picture. Here's a very charming couple of British Commonwealth country of Canada here in the garden. So that's my current wife and myself, my only wife. In 1995. So that's it. Does anybody have any questions? I was experimenting with a beer.
How was it to do the research for the Victorian League? And were there good records for it, or was it difficult?
Well, many ways it's exciting, but it was a bit overwhelming, because when you pick a PhD project, the smart students basically look at the archive first, and then they say, oh, I'm going to study the writings of some political leader, and then they find, oh, they're all in this one archive, and then they just spend months looking through them. I was attracted to these organizations first without really realizing where the records were, and so I had to do a lot of detective work. So I had to discover which leading figures were involved with the groups, Lord Curzon, Lord Milner, Lady Jersey, and then trace the personal papers. And then I had to figure out what papers had survived from these organizations to the present day. And I was able to discover this location, the Victoria League for Commonwealth Friendship. And I literally didn't know what I was going to find until I got there. And a lot of their records are pretty boring. They're like committee meeting books. But if you read them carefully, you can see how their activities evolved over the years, what their focuses were. And then in some libraries, I found their publications. They also published a lot of propaganda pamphlets in the war, which I didn't talk about in this discussion. So I traced those sort of publications as well. But it was sort of putting together a big puzzle, trying to figure it out. So I had endless notes and files and organizing stuff, but eventually I think I figured it out. So it was exciting, but a little daunting.
So I'm kind of intrigued by the slogan, sane imperialism and sane patriotism.
Yeah.
That seems to imply a critique of...
Yeah, I think to many Americans that's almost an oxymoron, like sane imperialism, because we, by default assume imperialism is a bad thing, and indeed it is in so many ways. But the Victoria League sort of was acknowledging that that's criticism out there. And they were basically feeling that some people took things too far, some people were, I would call masculinist, or we could say overly aggressive, too militaristic. So they were trying to, calm things down. So by avoiding political controversy, by trying to avoid being partisan, that's how they defined sane patriotism. Reading these minute books, you find some great little details. They had this very polite note that said, after the war, they were invited to participate in a conference on, quote, the abolition of the present social order, and they politely declined. They found it perhaps a little too radical for their taste. So when you read carefully, minute books, you can sort of see where they're coming from. And they did bring people from the Labour Party into the group after the war, which is the left of center political party in Britain. Sorry, question.
On that same topic, in the next generation, when there was a widespread global kind of anti-imperialist sentiment developing, how did the League grapple with that? Did they ever become outright anti-imperialist?
No, they just sort of kept going along their angle into, eventually the empire turns into a commonwealth, and so they made the evolution that way. What's interesting, and I didn't have time to talk about it after the war, is that they acknowledged outright opposition to empire, and one of the ways they tried to arrest it was by reaching out into groups they hadn't really dealt with before. There's a huge initiative, which I talk about in my book, where they approach students from the colony of Malaya, and these are students of Chinese heritage, students of Asian heritage, and they say right in there that if these students are left, alone in the capital, they often become very anti-British, very anti-imperialist, so we have to reach out to them. We can't just restrict ourselves to Canadians and Australians. And so they make this big outreach effort. And before the First World War, they weren't interested in that sort of thing. But in the changed climate, once the war's over, they do feel they have to address it. And another thing they do is they basically avoid talking much about politics in their publications, because there's all types of things going on after the war in India and Ireland and everywhere else, and they have a sort of noted silence. They just don't want to talk about it. But anyone who's living and breathing in London would know the empire's, in serious transition after the war. But it would, it doesn't really completely begin to fall apart till after World War II. So they can delude themselves a little while longer.
Matt, I was curious. The masculine organization was also very much into Christianizing the world,
that's true.
and
That's a good point.
I was wondering, there was kind of no mention of religion.
No, that's a good point. They don't really mention that much about it, to be honest. I mean, they talk about imperial consciousness, and they talk about, I guess, British characteristics, but religion isn't really a big thing.
So none of that was sort of Christianized. The
but-
proselytizing.
Yeah, but they really sort of ignore that. And there's a lot of major religious differences, even in Britain. I mean, they're going out of their way, I guess, to be ecumenical, but it's not really stressed as a key priority to Christianize, which is interesting. I think you're right.
Wouldn't that be because the Christianizing impulse in the male organization was externally oriented? It was part of the civilizing mission that
Yes, that's
underwrote
true,
colonialism and imperialism,
That's
whereas
true.
they were tending to the Commonwealth internally.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, they were more concerned with sort of non-British influences. I mean, and another thing I didn't discuss, after World War I, they're very concerned that in the Canadian West, especially, there's all this non-British literature. There's a lot of people from outside of Britain who are moving to the West, and a lot of the literature that people are reading, books and comics, and that they're all from the United States. They think we have to send British reading material, and they start gathering up old newspapers and books, and they ship them, to the Canadian prairies. Now, if you're freezing in a Saskatchewan night at -40, I don't think you care what you're reading. But burn it, it's warm. But that's what they, seem to want to focus upon. But that's true. That's a good way of putting it. They are certainly directed more towards these areas in which, Christianizing efforts wouldn't be the same priority. That's true. Any other questions?
What was the major source of money to sustain the Victoria League after World War I? And did it ever become egalitarian for its membership?
Well, they had relatively, I have to remember my figure, the entrance fees were relatively low. They relied on donations. A lot of you were people like Lady Jersey. If you're part of the executive committee, you were expected to pay up. I mean, they were never truly fully egalitarian, where, you know, they were solely based on a low subscription fee. So, you know, we're talking a relatively small budget, because they only had 3,000 members, they didn't have a big, you know, headquarters building to maintain. So it was a combination of subscriptions and then wealthy patrons, they had a list of those, but they never went all the way into a more egalitarian fundraising basis. Any other questions, Eddie?
Have you seen pictures of those 800,000 artificial copies in London right now?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
Yes, and again, this is a thing that interests me, is World War I is sort of an afterthought in, you know, U.S. history. I mean, we have a World War I memorial in Kansas City, Missouri, but how many people visited it in the United States? It's actually quite a nice structure, and pictures of it. But in, you know, in Britain, they still, every Remembrance Day, they have a ceremony at the Cenotaph, which is this very simple monument right in Whitehall, the big main government district, close to where 10 Downing Street is, and all the political leaders line up and they put a wreath on it. Everybody wears a poppy, you know, even the people reading the news and, you know, the people in Parliament. So it's a very solemn sort of thing. And, you know, they value the heroism of the soldiers, but there's a sort of a feeling of loss that I don't think we quite have echoed in the way we remember things. Because in many ways, even though the British won the First World War, they treated it almost like a loss in their poetry and their culture. And if you want to understand appeasement in the 1930s, that's straight out of that moment. They never wanted to go through a struggle like that again. So any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much.
There are books for sale over on the right. We have refreshments out the doors, and please fill out the comment cards if you have them before you leave. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Last from the past. Great photo. Yeah. Good commentary.